Hi, welcome to part two of our review for period three test. Sorry about the last cutoff there. The bell rang and I had to have a class come in, so we got cut off. But either way, we're going to finish going through period three here together. So this is, we're going to do modules 3.6 through 3.9. So reframing the American government is 3.6 all the way up through the George Washington presidency and the John Adams presidency. So um, we're at the Constitution. If you remember, Shays' Rebellion in 1786 basically convinces Americans that the federal government is too weak to handle any type of internal disputes that way. This Articles of Confederation kept the federal government from taxing its own citizens. It was up to the states to do so. The federal government could not raise an army. It was up to the states to do so. So the federal government was kind of hamstrung if there was ever going to be an incident like that again. The delegates agreed to meet in Philadelphia in 1787, not to write a constitution per se, but to revise the Articles of Confederation. When James Madison, the father of the Constitution, comes to Philadelphia, he has a constitution outlined already because he, along with many of the other founding fathers, realized that it's not fixable. The Articles of Confederation is set up to be too weak. It just isn't going to work if the country is going to prosper and to grow and expand. So 55 delegates meet in 1787 in Philadelphia. There are a couple of different, well, there are many different things that are separating the delegates. Some are big states versus small states, slave states versus free states, amongst other things. But the small states had a huge problem. They liked the ideals of the Articles of Confederation as far as the quality of the states. So they bring the New Jersey plan to the Constitutional Convention, a unicameral legislature with each state having equal representation. Whereas the Virginia plan does not like the ideals of the Articles of Confederation because the equality of the states sounds good, but that means that New Hampshire and Rhode Island and Delaware have equal power with New York and Pennsylvania and Virginia. So their plan, Virginia plan, calls for a bicameral legislature based on population. So, very long story short, the Great Compromise is instituted, which merges the two plans together. What we have today in the Constitution is a Virginia plan giving us a House of Representatives. It's each state gets representatives based on their population. And New Jersey and a New Jersey plan is which we have the modern day Senate, where each state has two senators that represent the equality of the states. Slavery was an issue in the Constitution, as we said. Nine of the 13 states had to agree to the Constitution in order for it to become official. Thus, the Northerners allowed for the three-fifths compromise, counting each slave as three-fifths of a person for representation purposes. They also allowed the slave trade to carry on through 1808. Other debates include the balance of power between the state and the central governments. So, federalism, that sharing of power between the federal and the state governments. Each state had a constitution which limited the power of a federal government. So, what they're trying to do here is make sure that the federal government is more powerful than under the Articles of Confederation, but that the states still had ample power and could not be dictated to. We won't worry about all the specifics of how the Constitution sets up our government, our framework for government, but do know that the Electoral College elects the president and not the people. So the only unanimously elected president in history was George Washington, and it happened twice. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists had differing philosophical beliefs at the Constitutional Convention. The Federalists are in favor of a strong constitution. Men like James Madison, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington were Federalists. Anti-Federalists included men like Thomas Jefferson, George Mason, people who were very leery of a strong central government, fearful that that could lead to another king. Anti-Federalists were holding out for a Bill of Rights because whereas many of the states had already included a Bill of Rights in their constitution, they were afraid that without a Bill of Rights that the federal government could eventually become too tyrannical. In 1787, in September, when the Constitutional Convention adjourns and the delegates had adopted it, it has to go back to the state legislatures. There's still a lot of question as to whether the Constitution is actually going to become our legal document. This is where the Federalist Papers come in, where John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison write letters to different New York newspapers convincing the American public that federalism is the way to go, that the federalist system is the way to go. Hamilton himself wrote 51 of the 85 papers. And again, in 1788, New Hampshire becomes the ninth state to adopt the Constitution. And by 1790, you have all 13 of the original states, Rhode Island, that sign on to the Constitution. Delaware is the first state. Pennsylvania is the second state because that was the order in which they signed the Constitution, that they adopted it. All right, legacies of the American Revolution. How legacy is how something is remembered. Um, if you remember correctly, the farmers themselves, or the lower classes of people, were predominantly the people fighting in the American Revolution. The continental currency is valueless because it's being overprinted. So many of these farmers are paid with land. They're given land, and some of these farmers do not get their land until upwards of 20 years after the war. So their struggle is not necessarily paid for on time. Women themselves are expecting greater independence and maybe more political authority in this country after the war. That doesn't come to fruition. New Jersey is the only state that grants women the right to vote. Um, we talk about African Americans. Many. Obviously, we're still a country that has slavery. The North is starting to gradually abolish slavery. In the South, they're starting to deeply institutionalize slavery. We're developing a distinct American culture but we won't really be discussing that on our test. We talked about slavery's ongoing legacy, and New Jersey, again, being the only state to grant women the right to vote, also gives property owning blacks the right to vote as well. In the South, obviously, the slavery is becoming more of an ingrained institution, and as we'll learn in period 4, once they discover that you can grow cotton in large quantities, the Southern economy really takes off, and slavery is more enmeshed in Southern economy than it will ever be. All right, 3-8, George Washington unites the nation. Again, he was the most universally respected figure of this time period, North and South. He was the commander in chief during the American Revolution. And if George Washington puts his stamp on something, people take it very seriously. Um, he creates the idea of the cabinet. He has 4 original departments. You got Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. You have Secretary of War Henry Knox, Treasury Alexander Hamilton. So Hamilton and Jefferson obviously have contrasting views of what the United States should be. Jefferson believed in the agrarian society, the nation of farmers, whereas Hamilton believed in the future of America being based in industries and in larger cities. So Hamilton, his goal is to stabilize the American economy and to establish credit so that nations in Europe will take us seriously and want to trade with us. Um, Going back a step before I go further, the Bill of Rights was instituted in 1791, adding the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, freedom of speech, religion, press, etc. All of that comes to appease the anti-federalists. All right, so going back to Hamilton's financial plan, um, he wants a national bank in order to stabilize national currency and to have a one place that the federal government deposits all of its money. Jefferson is very leery of this. He wants, again, the finances and the politics in our country separated. He does not want them intertwined. He wants them to be separate. So what he gets in return for giving his blessing to a central bank is that the capital is moved from New York City, eventually down to Philadelphia, and then by 1800 to what is now Washington D.C., which was called Washington City at the time. He wants the financial and the political centers of our country to be separated. He does not want them together. All right. Question is, who built Washington City? Again, there was a mixture of different immigrant groups, but a large deal of the heavy lifting and was done by slaves or free black men. Going back to George Washington here, do not forget that everything that he did established a precedent that the world was watching. The world was expecting the United States to fail. Many people in America were uncertain of how to proceed here because they had been used to living under a weak central government and before that a king, so they didn't know exactly how this American experiment was going to go. So, through the early years of our republic, there was no guarantee that this was going to be successful. And then moving into Section 3-9, political parties and years of crisis, when George Washington gives his farewell address, he warns against political parties. He says that it creates factions in the country and that it can create, and it can basically separate us from within, because he was witnessing this firsthand in the 1790s. You get the Democratic Republicans under Thomas Jefferson, and you have the Federalists under Alexander Hamilton, who have two fundamentally different visions of what America should be. Thomas Jefferson is he's very pro-French, whereas Alexander Hamilton is very pro-British. The French Revolution breaks out in 1789, lasts for about 10 years. One of Jefferson's ideals, again, was an agrarian society based on farming. the demand for American wheat skyrockets during the 1790s. So the farmers are doing very well. And to Jefferson, this validates his belief that the future of America is in farming. The biggest reason that our wheat prices climb and that we're doing so well economically as far as the farming goes is because the French Revolution disrupts agriculture in Europe. In 1793, France, Great Britain, Prussia, and Austria go to war. And the question is, whose side are we going to take? Many Americans believe that we owe the French, that they joined us during the American Revolution. Jefferson believes that we should join the side of the French. Hamilton and many other Federalists aren't so sure of that. In fact, they think, if anything, that the British are the side that we should join. They're the most powerful. Washington is afraid to join either side. Remember, we're a young nation. I use the example in class of we're a toddler nation. We're trying to get our feet under us. We're trying to figure out who we are, what direction we have as a country. So Washington in 1793 declares neutrality, that we're not going to side with Great Britain or France. Both countries ignore our neutrality and they start impressing sailors in the high seas and impounding American ships. Edmund Genet comes to America to try to enlist Americans on the side of the French. At this point, knowing that there's the possibility of war is looming over us, Washington sends John Jay to Britain to negotiate with the British because, again, the British are still on the western frontier. The British are fomenting rebellion among the Native American population. They're arming them and trying to convince them to attack American forts and settlements. The Spanish are doing the same thing in the South. We're trying to protect our frontier. We're trying to protect our bases to allow for westward expansion to continue. So when John Jay comes back, he comes back with a treaty that is very unpopular in the United States. It is adopted by the Federalist Congress, but for many, this is the moment where the Federalist Party has, basically trying to appease the British, and the Democratic Republicans gain strength from this. The Whiskey Rebellion, to many people, is reminiscent of the British tactics, prior to the Revolution, where a strong central government is taxing these Western farmers without their consent. They are the federal government. George Washington sends troops to repel the rebellion, which again is reminiscent to some Americans of what the British did in Boston back in the early 1770s. But what Washington is trying to establish with the Whiskey Rebellion, which does fail, the Whiskey Rebellion fails, he's trying to establish that the Constitution is strong enough to quell rebellion, to stop rebellion. Though some thought that the use of force was too excessive. And that's a hallmark through American history, is that some people think that a use of force is necessary in times of rebellion, whereas others see it as being excessive and sometimes even exacerbating that rebellion. All right. We talked in class today about the Treaty of Greenville after the Battle of Fallen Timbers, in which case the Northwest Territory was now open to white settlement, and they did not have to fear any Native American attacks, because again, if you're a Native American and you see white settlers coming to your region, there's a history of violence, and the fear here is that they're coming here to take your land again. So after the Battle of Fallen Timbers and the Treaty of Greenville, the U.S. is granted a large tracts of land, and this is going to greatly increase white settlement into what is now Western Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and the rest of the Northwest Territory. Pinckney Treaty gives American shipping access to the Mississippi River. Again, rivers are the highways of early America. And we talked earlier about how George Washington warned against factions because he saw them brewing within his own cabinet with Jefferson and Hamilton. His vice president, John Adams, becomes the second president. In 1796, you have the first two-party election in American history. The Federalists with Adams win against Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans. It's a very close race, but Adams wins. And from there, you can see here in this map the regional differences between the North and the South. The South is very heavily Democratic Republican, and the North in the coastal regions are very heavily Federalist. All right. Last two things. XYZ affair. In France, they're continuing to seize American merchant ships, and so John Adams sends envoys over to France to negotiate an end to this seizure of American ships. The French Foreign Minister Talleyrand sends 3 agents to demand bribes in order for talks to initiate between the Adams administration and the French government, in which case the Adams envoys say to the effect of millions for defense, not 1 cent for tribute. We will not, allow the French to demand a bribe from us, we will go back home, and we would rather fight a war than be taken advantage of like this. This leads to that quasi war, which is a war that's undeclared between France and the United States for 2 years on the high seas. At home, the fear of a war with France is hit a fever pitch. There are 3 acts that are passed that prove that the founding fathers themselves could not agree as to what exactly the Constitution meant when it was written and what the Bill of Rights meant. The Alien Acts, which say that basically foreigners can be deported at the will of the president, the Sedition Act, which makes it illegal to speak out against the president and his administration, and the Naturalization Act, which takes it from 5 to 14 years as far as how long you have to live here before you can seek citizenship. The Democratic Republicans are outraged. This gives them a rallying cry against the Federalists when it comes time for the election of 1800. And the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions are passed, which declare the Alien Sedition Acts void, which means that they aren't legitimate in the eyes of Kentucky and Virginia because the state governments created the federal government. Therefore, if the federal government passes a law which the states feel is unconstitutional, they feel they do not have to abide by it. The election of 1800. The period 3 is 1754, the beginning of the French Indian War, to 1800, which is the election of 1800. The Democratic Republicans and Thomas Jefferson defeat the Federalists and John Adams. There is a tie. Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr both tie the election of 1800, the same number of electoral votes. In the event of a tie, the election goes to the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives were not so sure of who to vote for when Thomas Jefferson's old enemy, Alexander Hamilton, comes in and delivers the election for him. The Federalists listen to Hamilton. They vote for Jefferson over Aaron Burr. This is actually going to get Alexander Hamilton killed 4 years later. But in the meantime, this was a huge wedge dividing many Americans, is the election of 1800. The remarkable thing about the election, and this is why Jefferson himself calls this the Revolution of 1800, this is the first time in American history where there's a transition of power between political parties. In 1801, actually, when the president takes office, Jefferson, you have the Federalist John Adams leaving office, and you have the Democratic Republican Jefferson coming into office. There is no bloodshed. The fear here was that the Federalists might do something violent to try to maintain their power, but it did not happen. So this is a successful transition of power, and it shows that the American experiment might work after all. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. If not, your test again Wednesday, 55 multiple choice questions. Have a wonderful day.